6 days remained before they stopped keeping Bogdan Vasilenko in this world, and the paper that decided it had been signed 2 weeks earlier. 19 doctors had read his scans and arrived at the same conclusion. 19 polite ways of saying one thing. The man in room 812 was no longer inside it. For 40 years in Providence, nobody had said the name Bogdan Vasilenko above a whisper. Now an entire hospital floor discussed him in front of him, and not one person thought to ask him a single question. His son Emrys was a man who could obtain anything in that city, anything except 15 minutes of authority over his own father's body. Every night after midnight, he walked past a federal marshal seated in the corridor, took the chair beside the bed, and counted his father's breaths, because counting breaths was the only thing he was still permitted to do. 19 of the finest physicians in New England had walked through that door, but none of them worked nights. None of them had stood in that room at 2 a.m, when the numbers on the monitors behaved differently. And none of them counted on the woman the hospital didn't consider worth a single daytime shift. The woman about to discover that the real question in room 812 had never been whether he was still in there, but who did not want anyone to find out. If Dell and Emrys's story reached you, leave a like so we know you stayed with them to the very end. Share it with someone who was once written off by people who decided for them that they weren't worth the effort. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, subscribe so the next one finds you. The family waiting room on the 8th floor had 9 plastic chairs and a vending machine that had been empty since the month before, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, it belonged to Emrys Vasilenko, for the simple reason that no one else dared to enter. Ephraim Boyd set his leather briefcase across both knees, opened it, and took out 3 sheets of paper. He'd been handling the law for this family for 19 years, and he knew the only way to speak to this man was plainly, completely, without cushioning a single word. "The first document is a federal court order," Boyd said, his voice low and steady. "Your father is a defendant in an investigation that hasn't yet concluded. Until a determination is made about whether he's competent to participate in the proceedings, he must remain in a medical facility designated by the court, under the supervision of the United States Marshals Service. That facility is Wellington, which means you can't take him anywhere. Not Boston, not New York, not a room in your own house with 12 machines and 6 doctors you've hired privately. He stays here, on this floor, until the court says otherwise." Emrys said nothing. He was looking at the door to room 812 at the far end of the hall, where a thin line of light spilled from beneath it. "The second document," Boyd said, and this time he paused for half a second before sliding it across. "This is the medical power of attorney your father executed in 2019. Emrys took the paper. He read it very slowly, as though the speed of his reading might alter what had already been printed there. On the line naming the person authorized to make decisions for his father when he could no longer decide for himself, Emrys's name wasn't there. His sister's was. Nadia. Boyd let the silence stretch long enough before continuing, because he understood that some things required a few seconds to swallow. "I've checked it 3 times, Boyd said. "It's valid. It's notarized, witnessed by 2 people, and there were no later amendments. Your father made it while he was still completely lucid, and he made that choice consciously." "Why?" Emrys said. It was the first thing he'd spoken since Boyd opened the briefcase. Boyd looked at him for a moment. "I was in the room the day he signed it," Boyd replied. "He said that if that day ever came, he didn't want you to be the one who had to put pen to paper. He said you'd already had to do too many things in his place, and this was the one thing he didn't want to give you." Emrys folded the document along its old creases and placed it on the chair beside him with extraordinary care, as though it were still something capable of hurting him if it lay even slightly out of place. "And the third," he said. Boyd didn't slide the 3rd sheet across. He simply held it in his hand. "Nadia signed it," Boyd said. 2 weeks ago. A directive to discontinue life-sustaining interventions. It's been entered into the chart, confirmed by neurology, and a date has been scheduled for it to take effect, 6 days from now." Outside the window, an ambulance pulled into the receiving bay below, its lights turning without a siren, and the red glow traveled once, slowly, across the waiting room wall before vanishing. Emrys sat perfectly still. This was the thing everyone who'd sat across from him during the 40 years of this organization knew and had learned to fear, that the worse the news became, the softer this man spoke, and when he went completely silent, that was when he was most dangerous. But Boyd had sat with him long enough that night to understand that this silence wasn't strength. This time, It was only a 34-year-old man trying to understand how he could buy a building with 2 phone calls and still have no right to say a single word about whether his father lived or died. "Is there any other way?" Emery said. "There is one," Boyd said. He pulled a packet from the briefcase, much thinner than the other 3 sheets. "That directive is based on a medical conclusion that your father no longer has cognitive function. If that conclusion is called into question, the directive can be delayed. I'm not asking the court for much. I'm not asking it to declare him well. I'm asking for 72 hours to conduct a recorded cognitive response assessment with witnesses, under proper procedure. 72 hours, 3 days, to reopen a door that 19 people have closed." Emery's turned his head for the first time in the entire conversation. "Then do it," he said. Boyd didn't move. "I need one thing," Boyd said, "and this is why I called you down here at 1 o'clock in the morning instead of sending you a message. The request for a stay can't carry only my signature. I'm a lawyer. I don't have the medical standing. The court will require a sworn affidavit from someone with medical expertise, someone who has directly observed your father and is willing to place their name on a document stating that there are reasonable grounds to believe the original conclusion was incomplete." Emery's understood the problem before Boyd finished speaking. He understood because for 40 years he'd grown up in a world that ran entirely on knowing who owed what to whom. "The only person who can sign something like that is someone who works in this building," he said. "And that document would say the head of neurology in this building misread the scans." Boyd nodded once. "I've called 4 people over the last 2 days," he said. 2 never called back. 1 listened to everything, and then told me he had 3 children and tuition debt. The 4th asked whether there was any way he could help without his name appearing anywhere. And when I told him there wasn't, he hung up. "No one at Wellington will sign, Emery's. Not because they think we're wrong. Because they know what happens to someone who signs that paper." Emery stood. He walked to the end of the hall, to the thin line of light beneath the door of room 812, and stopped there, 3 steps away, without opening it. The federal marshal sitting in the chair opposite turned a page of his newspaper and didn't look up. For 40 years in this city, there had been people who'd had to sell their homes because they'd displeased the old man lying in that room. Contracts had changed hands with a single phone call. Names had vanished from lists. Doors had opened at 3 o'clock in the morning simply because someone named Vasilenko had knocked. Emery's knew the exact price of everything in this city, and he knew how to pay every one of those prices. He spoke without turning around, and his voice was so quiet, Boyd had to take 1 step closer to hear him. "I can get anything in this city. I can't get 1 signature." Boyd didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. He only closed the briefcase, and the 2 men stood there in the 8th floor corridor, looking at the thin line of light spilling beneath the door, with 6 days left. Across the city, on the 3rd floor of a rental building on Cranston Street, Delphine Auclair opened her door at 7:15 in the morning after spending 12 hours on her feet, and the first thing she did was take off the nursing shoes that had been repaired twice with glue at the right heel. She left them beside the door, exactly where she always left them, because if she wore them 3 more steps into the apartment, she would sit down and wouldn't be able to stand again. On the dining table lay a white envelope, printed with the name of the Rhode Island State Board of Nursing Licensure. It had arrived on Tuesday, and still hadn't been opened. Dell walked past it, set down her bag, and didn't look at it a second time. From the kitchen came the scrape of a chair, followed by feet striking the wooden floor in the way only a 7-year-old child could walk, and Tamsin appeared in the doorway with both hands clenched tightly behind her back. "Guess," Tamsin said. Dell leaned against the edge of the table. "I haven't even had any water yet," she said. "Guess first," Tamsin said, holding both fists out in front of her. 2 tiny fists squeezed so tightly with effort that her knuckles had turned white. Dell studied those hands with the same seriousness she gave to every important matter. "Left hand," she said. Tamsin opened her left hand. It was empty. "I win," Tamsin said. "All right," Dell said. "Then it's in your right hand." "I haven't let you guess again yet," Tamsin said, hiding both hands behind her back, moving them around for a moment, then holding them out once more. Dell looked more carefully. She had learned in Detroit that the human body always revealed what the mouth tried to keep hidden, that there was the smallest difference between the way a hand held something and the way it held empty space, and she studied those 2 little fists with the same eyes she'd used for 4 years in intensive care. "Right hand," she said. Tamsin opened her right hand. It was empty. "I win again," Tamsin said. already beginning to laugh before Dell had time to react. "Fine," Dell said. "One more time." She placed both hands on the table, bent down until she was level with the child, and this time she truly concentrated. She watched to see which fist was clenched half a degree tighter, which shoulder rose a fraction higher, which way the child tilted her head while trying to look innocent. "Left hand," Dell said, with the confidence of someone who had read the chart correctly. Tamsin opened her left hand. Then she opened her right hand too. Both hands were spread wide, both palms faced upward, and both were empty. "I won 3 times in a row," Tamsin said, collapsing into laughter. The kind of laughter children give when they have beaten an adult completely and fairly, laughing so hard that she had to grab the edge of the table. "I wasn't hiding anything at all. You just thought I was." Dell straightened very slowly. She looked at the 2 small hands still open on the tabletop, both of them empty, and she laughed and said that it was cheating. And Tamsin said it wasn't cheating, because Dell hadn't asked whether there was anything there. She had only asked which hand it was in, and on that point the child was entirely right. Dell poured her a bowl of cereal and sat with her at the table for 20 minutes, not speaking about work, not speaking about the envelope, not speaking about the woman who had given birth to this child and was no longer there. A story Dell had told her once in a form a 7-year-old could carry and would tell again differently when she was older. Then she slept for 4 hours, woke a little before 1 in the afternoon, and while she stood in front of the closet taking out a clean uniform, she saw that the white envelope was still lying in the same place on the table. She knew what was written inside. She had known from the moment she saw the board seal. Leaving it unopened wouldn't change what it contained, but opening it would mean carrying those words with her into the night shift. And that night she had been assigned to a room on the 8th floor that, according to the head nurse, no one had volunteered to take in 3 weeks. Dell left the envelope on the table. She slipped into the shoes, repaired with glue beside the door, walked 40 minutes downtown, and for that entire journey she didn't think about the licensing board, didn't think about Detroit, and didn't think about the paper she would eventually have to open. She thought about 2 tiny hands spread open on the tabletop, both of them empty, and a child laughing so hard she had to cling to the edge of the table while saying that Dell had only thought there was something there. Reuben Tallow handed her the assignment sheet at 11 o'clock that night and didn't look her in the eye as he did it. He only said that room 812 was hers for the night, and that if she wanted to switch, he would try to find someone, though both of them knew he wouldn't find anyone. "No one has volunteered to take that room for 3 straight weeks, Reuben said, "and it isn't because of the patient." Dell took the assignment sheet, thanked him, and walked away. She had been working in rooms people didn't want to enter since she was 23, and a room everyone avoided usually meant only that the room had been abandoned, and an abandoned patient was a patient on the verge of trouble. After midnight, the 8th floor corridor was lit by the kind of night lighting every hospital used, bright enough to walk by but not bright enough to read. A man in a coat sat in the chair across from the door to room 812, with a newspaper resting on his knees. He watched her for exactly 2 seconds as she pushed the medication cart past him, then returned his attention to the paper, and Dell understood that he wasn't hospital security. She knocked twice out of habit before entering. Inside the room, the ventilator breathed with steady precision beneath the pale blue glow of the monitors. On the bed lay a 68-year-old man who had been there for 11 weeks, and in the chair at the corner of the room, about 2 steps from the bed, another man sat waiting. He didn't look up when she entered. "Good evening, sir," Dell said. "I'm Delphine Auclair. I'm assigned to this room tonight." The man in the corner didn't answer. Dell waited 3 seconds and then began her work, because she had learned long ago that the quickest way to ease the tension of someone keeping watch beside a bed wasn't to speak to them, but to let them see her hands caring for the person lying there. She checked the intravenous line, checked the catheter, inspected the skin over every pressure point, took his blood pressure and recorded it, then gently turned the patient's head to one side and adjusted the pillow in the way she would have to do again 2 hours later. She did all of it slowly and without speaking, and as she worked, she noticed 2 things. The first was that the man's skin was clean, and every pressure point was entirely intact, which meant that although the entire floor avoided this room, the basic nursing care was still being done very well, and that brought her some relief. The second was that his fingernails had been neatly trimmed, cut by a human hand rather than with hospital equipment, and Dell had been doing this long enough to know who trimmed the nails of an immobile 68-year-old man at 2 o'clock in the morning. She looked toward the chair in the corner. He still hadn't raised his eyes. The final task in her first round was to sign the physician's order log, something every night nurse in every hospital did, and no one considered important. The order log had 2 sections. The first contained the routine orders written by the attending physician during the day, typed, printed, coded, and electronically signed, and anyone could open it and read it at any time. The second contained the overnight verbal orders, instructions called down by the physician on duty, and written by hand by the night nurse before being signed and acknowledged. That section was recorded on the back of the page, and no daytime physician in the world had any reason to read the reverse side of the previous night's sheet. Dell turned the page over and began reading the line she was required to sign. The baseline dosage in the routine orders was completely normal. She checked it against the patient's weight, against his liver function, against all the things she always checked, and every number sat exactly where it belonged, even more cautiously calculated than she had expected. Then she read the verbal orders. An additional dose had been recorded at 1:40 in the morning. Another had been entered at 4:10. Both were within the permitted range. Both had reasons documented beside them in 3 entirely valid abbreviations. Both had been properly signed and acknowledged, and there wasn't a single thing on that page that a chart reviewer could point to and call wrong. Dell stood there with the pen in her hand and didn't sign. She read the 2 lines again. The problem wasn't the dosage. The problem was the time. 1:40 and 4:10 were very strange times to add medication for a patient in this condition. Not because doing so was dangerous, but because it wasn't necessary. Nothing happened to a patient like this at 1:40 in the morning that should have required it. She turned back several pages. It had happened the night before. It had happened the night before that. Not every night. Not at the same hour. Not regularly enough to form a pattern someone would notice while flipping through the pages quickly. But it was there. Dell didn't understand what it meant. She had been in the profession long enough to know that most things that looked strange in a chart had some dull explanation, and that every nurse had experienced a night when something seemed wrong, only to learn the next day that it had been nothing more than a faulty printer. She did only one thing. She took a small notebook from her uniform pocket, the one she used to record things she would need to remember, and wrote down 2 times, 1:40, 4:10. Then she signed the order log, because she was required to sign it, and closed the book. Is there a problem? Dell looked up. The man in the corner was watching her. It was the first time in 40 minutes that he had raised his eyes, and his voice was so low and slow that it took her half a second to be certain he had spoken. "No, sir," Dell said. She slipped the notebook back into her pocket, pushed the medication cart toward the door, and didn't say another word. The following night, Dell arrived 20 minutes early, and the first thing she did wasn't go into room 812. Instead, she sat at the nurse's station with the physician's order logs from the previous 7 days and a sheet of scrap paper, and she calculated. She calculated the medication's half-life, the timing of the baseline dose, the timing of the 2 additional doses, and she circled the period when the level of medication in the man's body was at its lowest during the 24-hour cycle. That period fell between 2:15 and 3:40 in the morning. 45 minutes, perhaps a little longer. She called it the trough, wrote those 2 words in the corner of the scrap paper, then folded it and slipped it into her pocket. On the first night, she entered the room at 2:20. Emrys Vasilenko was sitting in the corner just as he had been the night before, and just as before, he said nothing. Dell performed everything she was required to do in the same order she always followed, and when she was finished, she stood at the head of the bed and did one very small thing that no hospital rule forbade her from doing. She called the patient's name. "Mr. Vasilenko," she said in an ordinary voice, not loudly. "I'm Delphine. I'm assigned to you tonight." Then she fell silent and watched the monitor. His heart rate was 58. It had remained at 58 throughout the 40 minutes she had been working in the room. 7 seconds after she called his name, it rose to 63, stayed there for about 15 seconds, then returned to 58. Dell didn't move a single muscle in her face. She had been in the profession long enough to know that a person's heart rate could change for 100 reasons, and that 5 beats meant nothing at all. And she had also been in the profession long enough to know that the reason people said 5 beats meant nothing was because they didn't want to have to explain it. She waited 12 minutes. Then she called his name again, in exactly the same voice. 7 seconds. 63. 15 seconds. 58. She wrote it in her small notebook and recorded nothing else. On the second night, she entered the room at 2:25 and she didn't call his name. This time, she did something different. Something every nurse did several times each night, and no one considered a test. She lifted his hand to inspect the intravenous line. She held it longer than necessary. 3 minutes, then 4. With 2 fingers resting against the base of his palm just beneath the thumb, while she looked toward the window like someone thinking about something else. During the 2nd minute, she felt it. The movement was so slight that if she had been speaking, if she had been holding a pen in her other hand, if she had been thinking about anything else at all, she would have missed it. A faint twitch in the deep muscle beneath the base of the palm, then a pause, then another. Dell counted. The pause between the 1st and 2nd was the same length as the pause between the 2nd and 3rd. The 4th came a little late, then the 5th returned to the rhythm. It wasn't the random firing of nerves that were dying, because death had no rhythm. Death didn't wait for the proper interval before beginning again. Dell lowered his hand, adjusted the pillow, and left the room. And as she stood in the 8th floor corridor beneath the night lighting that wasn't bright enough to read by, she realized she knew this. She had spent 4 years in a neurological intensive care unit in Detroit, and she had seen this 4 times, and in all 4 cases, she hadn't been the one who discovered it. On the 3rd night, she arrived with a small flashlight in her pocket and entered the room at 2:18. She repeated what she had done the night before, placing 2 fingers against the base of his palm, and waited until she caught the rhythm. Then she did something that, this time, she couldn't tell herself was routine care. She shifted to one side so she wouldn't block the light, leaned down, and watched his eyelids while her 2 fingers remained against the base of his palm. The first twitch. At that exact moment, both eyelids trembled once, so slightly that it could have been anything. A pause. The 2nd twitch. His eyelids trembled again, perfectly synchronized, without even a fraction of a second between them. Dell straightened. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. In the corner, Emery's Vasilenko didn't look up, and Dell was grateful for that, because she wasn't certain what her face looked like then. She left the room, walked the full length of the corridor, pushed open the door to the emergency stairwell, and stood there with the small notebook open in her hand. She turned back 3 pages and reread what she had written over the course of 3 nights. Then she understood what only those 3 nights together had been able to tell her, and it sent a chill down her spine in a way nothing in Detroit ever had. Every one of those responses, all 5 beats of the heart, the rhythmic twitch, the synchronized trembling of both eyelids, appeared only during the trough. There was nothing at 11 o'clock at night, nothing at 5 in the morning, only during the 45 minutes between 2:15 and 3:40, when the medication level in that man's body reached its lowest point, which meant that throughout the previous 11 weeks, every doctor who entered that room had done so outside the trough, and not one of those 19 people had ever stood inside room 812 at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then Dell turned to the last page, where she had written down the timing of the additional doses over 7 days, and she calculated it a second time, more carefully, because she wanted to be wrong. On the first night, the trough lasted 45 minutes. On the second, it lasted 38. On the third, the night she had just stood inside it, it lasted only 31 minutes. 31 minutes. Dell stood in the emergency stairwell with that number and tried to find a dull explanation for it, because that was the first thing a good nurse had to do before doing anything else. A different physician had been on duty. A nighttime episode of tachycardia had required intervention. She had made an error while reading her own handwriting. She tested each explanation one by one, and not a single one would hold, because the same physician had been on duty all 3 nights, because there wasn't a single measurement in the chart suggesting that anything had happened that required intervention, and because the handwriting in the notebook was hers, recorded on the spot, written down at the very moment she read it. She closed the notebook and walked back into the corridor, and that was when she saw the orderly. Dell wasn't certain what his name was because he had never told her, and she had worked enough night shifts in enough places to know that some people didn't want to give their names, and that it didn't necessarily mean anything. He was the man who had pushed the towel and linen cart up to the 8th floor 3 times every night throughout the 2 weeks she had worked there. A man of about 40, neat, quiet, quick at his work, never stopping to speak with anyone, and Dell had once thought privately that if everyone in the hospital worked the way he did, the 8th floor would be a much better place. Now he was walking toward the far end of the corridor without a cart, carrying nothing in either hand. He passed the door to room 812, past the chair where the man in the coat still sat with the newspaper, and didn't look at either of them. Then he reached the door leading to the freight elevator at the northern end of the corridor, a door that was always locked after midnight and could only be opened with an access card. Dell was standing about 15 meters away, in the darkness between two night lights, and she hadn't meant to watch. She was only walking back toward the nurse's station. The man took a card from his pocket and swiped it across the reader. The light turned green. The door opened, and during the half-second before he stepped through, the card was still in his hand, and Dell saw it. Wellington Memorial employee badges were pale blue, with a photograph in the upper left corner, a name, a job title, and the 3 numbers identifying the department embossed at the lower right, and every employee in the building wore one around the neck or clipped to a breast pocket because it was required, and because security would remind them if they didn't. The card in that man's hand was white. It had no photograph, no name, no 3 numbers at all. It was only a piece of white plastic with a magnetic strip on the back, the kind of card a building issued to contractors, cleaning companies, or air conditioning repair workers, the kind that opened one specific door and told no one who was carrying it. The door closed behind him. Dell remained where she was for about 10 seconds. Then she walked 4 steps to the nurse's station, opened the computer, and searched the 8th floor staffing system for that night. 1 orderly had been assigned. Her name was Marcy Delacroix. She was 58 years old, and she was inside room 804 at that very moment, because Dell had seen her there 4 minutes earlier. There was no second orderly. There was no other name. There wasn't a single line anywhere in the system saying that a 40-year-old man was pushing a linen cart up to the 8th floor 3 times that night. Dell closed the computer. She returned to the emergency stairwell, pushed open the heavy door, and stood beneath the single light with the small notebook in her hand. She opened it and stared at the 3 pages of her own writing as though she were reading them for the first time. For the previous 2 weeks, she had believed she was investigating a medical problem. She had thought that perhaps 19 doctors had misread a scan, that perhaps a man had been abandoned behind a door no one wanted to open, that this was the old story of indifference and excessive certainty, the story she had witnessed in Detroit and had paid for. But those doses weren't indifference. Indifference didn't have a rhythm. Indifference didn't shorten a trough from 45 minutes to 38, and then to 31 over 3 consecutive nights. And indifference didn't require a white access card without 3 department numbers. Dell added 1 more line to the notebook, the first line in 3 nights that wasn't a number. She wrote that what was happening in room 812 wasn't medical. Then she closed the notebook, slipped it into her uniform pocket, and finished her shift until 7 o'clock in the morning. And she did her work well because it was the only thing she could still control. She arrived home at 7:20. Tamsin was still asleep. The white envelope from the Rhode Island State Board of Nursing licensure was still lying on the dining table exactly where it had been for 4 days. Dell sat down, and this time she opened it. The contents filled 1 typed page divided into 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph reminded her that the 5-year monitoring agreement between her and the board remained in effect and would end in April of the following year. The second was a routine reminder of her reporting obligations. The third was the sentence she had known would be there from the moment she saw the seal, and knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier when she read it with her own eyes. While the agreement remained in effect, any formal complaint entered against her, regardless of the outcome of the review, would be considered a violation of the terms of monitoring and would result in the permanent revocation of her nursing license. Regardless of the outcome of the review, Dell read those 6 words 3 times. It meant that right or wrong didn't matter. It meant that all anyone had to do was file a piece of paper. She folded the letter along its old crease, placed it on the table, and sat there for a very long time in the silent apartment, with a notebook in her uniform pocket and a 7-year-old child sleeping in the next room. 5 days remained. Dell slept for 3 hours, then woke and went to the hospital at 11 o'clock in the morning, 8 hours before her shift began, because she had spent 3 hours lying awake in bed weighing 1 question, and she had finished weighing it. The question wasn't what was happening in room 812. The question was whom she should tell, and the answer she arrived at, after discarding every answer that seemed more intelligent, was that she had to tell the person responsible for the case, because that was what a nurse was supposed to do, and because if she went around him, everything she said afterward would be read as an act against him, rather than a report concerning the patient. Dr. Aurelio Santangelo, head of neurology, had an office on the 6th floor with a window overlooking the parking lot and a secretary who told Dell that he had 10 minutes before his 11:30 meeting. Dell said 10 minutes would be enough. He invited her to sit, and she did, keeping the small notebook on her knees rather than placing it on his desk. And she began speaking exactly the way she had practiced during those 3 hours in bed, which meant not one word carried emotion, not one sentence contained speculation, and not once did she use language that a professional board could call exaggerated. She said that she had been assigned to room 812 for 3 consecutive nights. She said that the patient's baseline dose in the routine orders was appropriate, and that she had no objection to the baseline dose. She said that the overnight verbal orders contained additional doses recorded at times she would like permission to read aloud specifically, and she read them 13 times across 7 nights, without being wrong by a single minute. She said that when she calculated the medication's half-life, the period during which the drug level in the patient's body was at its lowest fell between 2:15 and 3:40 in the morning. She said that during that exact period, on 3 consecutive nights, she had observed 3 phenomena: a heart rate increase of 5 beats lasting approximately 15 seconds, beginning 7 seconds after verbal stimulation and repeating twice during the same night; a twitching movement in the deep muscle beneath the base of the palm, occurring at regular intervals rather than in isolated discharges; and movement of the eyelids occurring simultaneously with the movement in the hand, with no delay detectable within the limits of visual observation. She said that none of those 3 phenomena appeared outside that period. Then she delivered the final sentence, the one she had revised more times than any other during those 3 hours in bed, and she said it plainly, without emphasis. "I'm not offering a diagnosis, doctor. I'm reporting that no one has observed this patient during the period when observation might produce a result, and I believe that should be done before the directive is carried out." Santangelo said nothing for 4 seconds. He didn't look at the notebook on her knees. He didn't ask about the medication's half-life, didn't ask where she had gotten the figure of 7 seconds, didn't ask what kind of light she had used to observe the eyelids, didn't ask whether she had recorded anything, and didn't say a single word about imaging, the cerebral cortex, or any of the things a head of neurology would ask within the first 30 seconds if he were truly listening to a medical report. The first thing he said was that he appreciated her taking the time to come and speak with him. The second thing he said was that the case had been reviewed by 19 of his colleagues, and that he understood cases like this were always difficult for the people closest to the patient. The third thing he said was that she had spent 4 years working in a neurological intensive care unit in Detroit, hadn't she? Dell sat perfectly still. She hadn't said a word about Detroit, not during these 10 minutes, not during the 3 weeks she had worked in this building, not to Ruben, not to anyone. And the head of a department in a hospital with 1,200 employees didn't happen to know about 4 years spent in another city by a night nurse who had been hired only 3 weeks earlier. He had read her file. He had read it before she sat down in that chair. "Yes," Dell said. Santangelo nodded slowly, then continued in a voice Dell would remember for a very long time afterward. Because of everything she heard in that building, this was the gentlest voice of all. He said that he had reviewed her file when she was hired, just as he reviewed the files of everyone assigned to rooms under his department's responsibility. He said he had found nothing in it that made him object to her employment, and that he understood what happened in Detroit had been a matter of documentation, and that anyone could make a documentation error. He said there was only one thing he wanted to tell her, as someone who had spent 30 years in the profession. "A 5-year monitoring agreement is a very fragile thing," he said, "and what makes it fragile isn't the decisions of the board, but the number of papers filed with it." He said that a nurse working under such an agreement should think very carefully about how many records her name appeared in, because every time a name appeared in a dispute, that name became a little thinner, even when the person carrying it was right. He said he was telling her this for her own good. Then he looked at his watch, apologized that he had to attend his meeting, and stood. Dell stood as well. She thanked him and left the office, walked the length of the 6th-floor corridor, and took the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed 7 floors in which to think. During those 7 floors, she didn't think about the warning, because the warning was the easiest thing in the entire meeting to understand. She thought about what she had seen beneath it. A man who was certain he was right would argue. He would ask her about the light, about the recording, about the medication's half-life. He would explain it to her in words she wasn't qualified enough to challenge, and he would do it with pleasure, because that was what men like him loved most in the world. Santangelo hadn't asked her a single medical question. He had gone directly to the name Detroit within 3 sentences, and he had read her file beforehand, and a person prepared that way only when he already knew someone would come knocking at his door. What lay beneath that gentle voice wasn't certainty. It was fear. Dell arrived at the hospital that night at 10:40, 20 minutes early as she always did, and she knew something was wrong from the moment she stepped out of the elevator onto the 8th floor, because Ruben Tallow was standing at the nurse's station waiting for her, doing nothing, both hands resting on the counter, and a head nurse at 10:40 at night was never doing nothing. He handed her a sheet of paper. It was a standard form from Human Resources, 1 page long, and 3/4 of the page consisted of blank fields that had nothing to do with her. The relevant section contained 4 lines. Nurse Delphine Auclair was being transferred from the 8th floor neurology unit to the 5th floor general medicine unit. The stated reason was routine staff rotation to balance shift requirements, effective immediately. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone in Human Resources whom Dell had never met. Dell read it twice. Santangelo's name appeared nowhere on the page. Neurology wasn't named on the line identifying who had requested the transfer. There wasn't a single word anyone could later point to and say that this had been directed at her. It was only a piece of paper reassigning a night nurse, something that happened every week in every hospital in America. And if Dell told anyone about it, that person would ask her what the problem was, and she wouldn't be able to answer because there was no problem at all. That was what made it perfect. "I start on the 5th floor tonight," she said. "Right now," Ruben said. He was still looking down at the counter. "I'll reassign any rooms you haven't taken yet." Dell had no rooms she hadn't taken because her shift hadn't even begun. She asked him one question, and she didn't ask it to make things harder for him. She asked because she needed to know. "Ruben," she said, "who requested this?" Ruben Tallow was 44 years old and had worked in that building for 16 years, and Dell had worked under him for 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, he had never spoken a single unkind sentence to her. He raised his head and tried to look her in the eye, and he couldn't. His gaze shifted to the side, toward the monitor behind her shoulder, and he said exactly one sentence. "This wasn't my decision." Then he handed her a new badge and took back the old one, because employee badges at Wellington were issued by department, and the 3-digit code in the lower right corner was the access code for the doors, and her new badge carried the 3 digits for the 5th floor. Dell took it. She understood exactly what had happened, and she understood it far more quickly than Ruben could have explained it. She hadn't been suspended. She wasn't under investigation. No one had accused her of anything, and because no one had accused her of anything, she had nothing to appeal, and because she had nothing to appeal, no document would be filed anywhere, and because no document would be filed anywhere, her name wouldn't become even slightly thinner. The man on the 6th floor had done exactly what he'd told her he wanted to do for her own good. He had protected her name by taking away the room. Dell took the stairs down to the 5th floor and began working. And the 5th floor was a 22-bed general medicine unit staffed by 3 nurses on the night shift, which meant she didn't have a single minute to think for 7 straight hours. And she worked well, because she always worked well. At 3:10 in the morning, she was standing in the medication preparation area when she realized that at that very moment, 6 floors above her, the trough was opening and would close again in about 30 minutes, and no one was standing in that room. It wasn't that no one had noticed. It was that no one was permitted to notice. The badge in her uniform pocket carried the 3 digits for the 5th floor, and those 3 digits wouldn't open the 8th floor doors after midnight. And if she tried to swipe it across the reader, the system would record a denied access attempt under her name and the exact time, and that would become the first piece of paper. She reviewed in her mind everything she still had. She no longer had access to the medication chart because the orders for one unit appeared only to badges assigned to that unit. She no longer had access to the monitors because telemetry data appeared only at workstations on the corresponding floor. She could no longer stand at the head of the bed, call a man's name, and count 7 seconds. She no longer even had the right to lift his hand and inspect the intravenous line. 11 weeks of telemetry data still existed somewhere inside the hospital's system, and she had no way to retrieve even one line of it without breaking the law, and she understood enough about breaking the law to know that the day she took it would be the day everything she said became worthless. She still had the small notebook in her pocket, 13 times written by hand across 7 nights, 3 nights of observation, 1 line written in the emergency stairwell saying that what was happening in room 812 wasn't medical. That was all. At 7 o'clock that morning, She walked out of the building into a cold rain, and she stood at the curb waiting for the bus with the notebook in the pocket of her scrub top, and she did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She counted. She counted the number of people inside that building who could sign a document stating that the man in room 812 needed to be observed again. She counted 1, and that person had just been transferred to the 5th floor. 4 days remained. Dell slept for 5 hours and returned to the hospital at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, wearing a gray sweater and jeans, not her uniform, because she hadn't come to work, and because she had reasoned that if she arrived in her 5th floor uniform, everything she said would be an act performed by a hospital nurse, while if she came in a sweater, she would be nothing more than a person standing in a waiting room open to the public. The family waiting room on the 8th floor was accessible with any badge, and Dell had known that since her first night. She sat in the chair near the empty vending machine and waited for 40 minutes, and then the woman she had been waiting for came out of the corridor. Dell had read the name in the chart enough times to know who she was, but she had imagined her incorrectly. She had imagined a cold woman, someone dressed in expensive clothes who signed documents with a pen she carried in her pocket. The woman who emerged into the corridor was 31 years old and looked as though she hadn't slept properly in months. She was carrying a coat in her hands instead of wearing it, and she stopped in the middle of the hallway to breathe, the way someone stopped after leaving a room they had been forced to make themselves enter. "Miss Vasilenko," Dell said. Nadia turned. Dell gave her name, said she was a nurse, and had been assigned to her father's room for 3 nights, and asked for 5 minutes. Nadia studied her for a moment, then sat in the plastic chair opposite her, doing so with the air of someone who had sat down in this waiting room so many times that her body already knew the way. She said she didn't know what else there was left to say. She said that during the past 11 weeks, she had listened to many people tell her many things, and all of them had said the same thing. Then she spoke 3 sentences, and she spoke them the way people spoke words they had learned by heart. She said that at this stage, it was a matter of maintenance, not treatment. She said that what remained was to keep her father from suffering anything more. She said that she had to prepare herself to face the truth, that the father she had once known was no longer there. Dell sat perfectly still. She had heard those 3 sentences before. Not 3 sentences that merely meant the same thing. The same words, in the same order, with even the same pause between the 2nd sentence and the 3rd. And she had heard them on the 6th floor, inside an office with a window overlooking the parking lot, 2 days earlier, from the mouth of a man who had spent 30 years in the profession. She didn't say that aloud. She asked Nadia whether she believed those 3 sentences. Nadia looked down at her hands. She said she no longer knew what she believed. She said she had sat in that room every day for the first 6 weeks, and by the 7th week she couldn't make herself go inside anymore, and she had thought it was because she was weak, but people had told her it wasn't, that it was because she had understood something her brother still hadn't understood. Then she said the thing Dell had come there to find, without knowing she was searching for it. She said people believed she had made all the decisions about this, and that wasn't true. She said she hadn't even known she held the power of attorney until someone sat down and explained it to her. She said she hadn't known what steps a directive like that required, where it had to be filed, which department had to confirm it, and she said she hadn't chosen the date either. "Someone helped me arrange everything," she said. "They handled the paperwork for me, handled speaking to the hospital for me, and they only brought me the final document and showed me where to sign. And I signed it because by then I hadn't slept for 3 nights, and because everything they told me matched what the doctors had said." She said she was grateful for it. She said that without that person, she didn't know how she would have managed. Dell listened to all of it. Then she asked one question, and she asked it in the most ordinary voice she could make, because she understood that this question could only be asked once, and if it sounded like an investigation, she would never receive an answer. "Who helped you arrange it?" Nadia looked up, and during those 2 seconds, the exhausted woman saw something change on the face of the nurse sitting across from her. Something very small. Not shock, not sympathy, but the look of someone who had just heard the final sentence of a story they had begun reading from the middle. Nadia didn't understand why the question mattered. To her, it was the least important question of all the questions that existed in the world at that moment, because her father had 4 days left, and what difference could the name of the person who had helped with the paperwork possibly make? "Why are you asking?" Nadia said. Dell said she only wanted to know whom she should speak with to ask about the records. Nadia believed her, because there was no reason not to, and because it was a reasonable answer for a nurse to give. She opened her bag and searched for her phone, so she could look up a name she wasn't certain how to spell. And while she searched, she said that he was a family man, that he had been with her father for 40 years, and that he was the only person in the entire family her brother listened to. Dell didn't use her badge. She stood in the family waiting room from 11 o'clock that night, still wearing the gray sweater, and she waited, because she knew the man passed through there every night after midnight, and because it was the only place on the 8th floor where she still had the right to stand. He arrived at 12:20. He walked past the waiting room without looking inside, and Dell stepped into the corridor and called his name. Mr. Vasilenko. He stopped. He looked at her for 2 seconds, and she understood that he recognized her, and she also understood that he noticed the sweater and the absence of a badge on her pocket, and that he knew what those things meant before she had spoken a single word. He opened the door to room 812 and held it for her, and Dell stepped inside, while the man in the coat, sitting in the chair across the hall, turned a page of his newspaper without looking up. She stood at the foot of the bed and handed Emrys the small notebook. Emrys sat in the chair in the corner and began to read. He read for a very long time. Dell had imagined he would turn the pages quickly, ask about the parts he didn't understand, and she had prepared herself to explain the 13 times from 7 nights in language someone outside medicine could follow. But he didn't ask. He spent nearly 3 minutes reading the first page, then turned back and read it again. He stayed longest on the page containing the 13 numbers. He read the final page, the page with the single line that wasn't a number, and remained there for a long time, and during that time, no one in the room spoke, and the only sounds were the ventilator and the numbers moving across the monitor. Then he closed the notebook, held it on his knees, and asked the first question. "Are you certain?" Dell said no. She said she wasn't certain his father was conscious. She said 5 heartbeats could simply be 5 heartbeats, that a twitch in the deep muscle could simply be a twitch in the deep muscle, that everything in the notebook taken together still wasn't a diagnosis, and that she wouldn't lie to him about that. Then she said the rest. "I'm not certain he's conscious," she said. "I'm certain no one has examined him at the time when an examination might work." Emrys asked the second question. "What happens to my father if you're wrong?" Dell had prepared for that question, and it still took her a second to answer. She said that if she was wrong, his father would remain exactly as he was now. She said that what she was proposing would take nothing from him, add nothing to him, and contained nothing that could make his condition worse, and that this was the only reason she had allowed herself to stand there, because if there had been any possibility that it could harm the man in the bed, she wouldn't have come. He asked the third question. "What do you want?" Dell said she wanted someone to observe him once between 2:15 and 3:40 in the morning and document what happened. She said she didn't need to be the person who did it. Emrys watched her for a moment, then asked a question that wasn't among the 3. He asked what she would gain. He said he had been sitting in that chair for 11 weeks and had learned how a hospital operated, and he knew that a nurse who had just been transferred off the floor had no reason to be standing in that room at midnight without a badge. He said he wasn't asking in order to catch her in a mistake. He said that in 40 years, no one had ever walked into a room and handed him something without expecting something in return, and he wanted to know. Dell gave him 1 sentence. She said her younger sister had died 3 years earlier, that she was raising her sister's child, and that she had learned from it that the worst thing wasn't losing someone, but knowing there had once been a moment when something could still have been done, and no one had done it. She said nothing more. She didn't tell him how it had happened, and he didn't ask. Emrys sat in silence for a very long time. Then he said he had bought the loyalty of many people during his life, and that purchased loyalty was always sufficient for ordinary things, and always disappeared on the exact day it was needed most, because anything with a price could always be bought by someone willing to pay more. He said that what she had just placed on his knees had no price, and that it was the first thing anyone had given him in 11 weeks that was like that. Then he handed the notebook back to her. "No," he said. Dell stood there with the notebook in her hand and didn't understand. Emrys said there was a man in a coat sitting outside that door every night, and that the man wasn't there to guard a patient. He said he was a defendant in an investigation that hadn't concluded, that every telephone call he made was recorded, that the name of every person he contacted was documented, and that if he picked up the telephone that night and caused a document to be signed inside that building, by morning there would be a record stating that he had influenced medical personnel in a matter in which he had a personal interest, and that document would no longer have any value before any court. He said that if he helped her, the first thing that would happen was that she would lose her license, The second was that everything in the notebook would become something he had manufactured, rather than something she had observed. And the third was that his father would die sooner than the 4 days he had left, because there would be no one remaining to ask questions. He spoke the final sentence very slowly. "If I touch this, I kill him." Dell asked who would do it, then. Emery's didn't answer. He only looked toward the man in the bed, and Dell understood that he wasn't withholding anything from her. He didn't answer because he didn't know. She slipped the notebook into the pocket of her sweater and left room 812. And the man in the coat in the corridor turned another page of his newspaper, and she walked the entire length of the 8th floor hallway with empty hands. That morning, Tamsin woke before she did, and when Dell came out of her room at 9 o'clock, a large sheet of paper covered in colored pencil was already spread across the dining table. "This is my city," Tamsin said. "Sit down here and I'll show you." Dell sat. The city had 7 roads, all drawn with a ruler, and all of them met in the middle at a square colored yellow that Tamsin said was the park, and the park contained 4 trees, drawn larger than any one of the 7 roads. There was a house in the upper right corner with 2 windows and an arrow pointing toward it, and beside the arrow were 4 words written in red pencil: "Our house." There was a lake. The lake had 3 ducks, and Tamsin said they were all named Cookie. Dell asked why all 3 ducks were named Cookie. Tamsin said it was because Cookie was the best name, and if only one of them got to have it, the other 2 would be treated unfairly. Then she stood, pulled her chair back, and solemnly announced that the city needed a mayor, and that because she was the one who had drawn it, she was the one who got to choose. And she chose Dell. Dell asked what the mayor had to do. Tamsin said the mayor had to keep the map safe. Dell said that was an important job. She folded the map into 4 sections exactly the way Tamsin instructed, stood, and slipped it into the pocket of the scrub top hanging over the back of the chair, and Tamsin watched her do it with the satisfaction of someone who had just completed an official procedure in perfect accordance with the rules. Dell went to work at 10 o'clock that night, and she carried the map in the pocket of her scrub top because she had forgotten to take it out, and because she couldn't see any reason to take it out. Her locker was in the 2nd floor changing room, 3rd row, lock number 41. And she opened it at 10:15 to put away her bag and take out her stethoscope. And she knew immediately, not because anything had been disturbed, but because everything was too neat. She kept her belongings in an order she had followed throughout 11 years in the profession. The stethoscope on the hook to the left, her coat folded at the bottom, and the small notebook resting on top of the coat. The stethoscope was still on the left hook. The coat was still folded at the bottom, folded into a neater square than the one she had made. The small notebook wasn't there. Dell stood before the open locker for 2 minutes. She checked the coat pockets. She checked beneath the coat. She removed everything and placed it on the bench, examined each item one by one, and then returned every piece to its proper place, because that was what her hands did on their own while her mind was somewhere else. The lock hadn't been forced. It was the kind of combination lock used by the hospital, and facilities kept an emergency master key, and every use of that key required a request form. And Dell knew that if she asked, there would be a valid request form with a valid reason, because everything in this building had been valid so far. She closed the locker, went up to the 5th floor, and worked her shift. At 4:20 in the morning, she was called to the general medicine head nurse's office, where someone from Human Resources whom she had never met was waiting with another sheet of paper. This paper wasn't a transfer form. It was a notice stating that an internal report concerning her had been forwarded to hospital administration, that the report alleged she had conducted observations and made notes outside the physician's orders regarding a patient beyond the scope of her assigned duties, and that she would be informed of the review process in due course. Dell read it once. She asked for the date on which the report had been filed. The Human Resources representative said the report had been made the previous afternoon. The previous afternoon, which meant before Dell had opened her locker. It meant someone had read the notebook, written a report based on what was inside it, submitted that report to hospital administration, and completed all of it before she even knew what she had lost. It meant the person hadn't taken the notebook to silence it. The person had taken it to use it. Dell signed to acknowledge receipt of the notice because she was required to sign, and she finished her shift through 7 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't raining. The employee parking lot lay west of the building, and Dell crossed it on her way to the bus stop, and Ruben Tallow was standing beside his car, and he had been waiting there because the engine wasn't running, and because he was holding the key in his hand without putting it into the ignition. "Dell," he said. Dell stopped. Ruben looked at her. and this time he was able to meet her eyes, and that look was far worse than his inability to meet them before. "I'm sorry," he said. Dell asked what he was sorry for. He didn't answer. She asked whether he knew who had opened her locker. He didn't answer. She asked whether he knew what had been written in the report. He didn't answer any of her questions, and Dell saw on the face of that 44-year-old man something she had seen many times during 11 years in the profession, on the faces of patients' families, on the faces of colleagues, and once on her own face in a mirror in Detroit. The look of someone carrying something they couldn't put down. Then he spoke one sentence, and he said it quickly, as though if he slowed down, he wouldn't be able to finish it. "Don't trust anyone who tells you they're protecting you." He opened the car door, got inside, and drove away. Dell remained in the parking lot with both hands in the pockets of her scrub top, and in the right pocket, beneath her fingertips, was a sheet of paper folded into 4 sections. She stood there for a very long time, trying to fit the sentence she had just heard to one of the people she had met during the previous 4 days. And she couldn't, because too many people inside that building had told her they were doing something for her own good, and because among them was one person she had trusted. 3 days remained. Ephraim Boyd filed the petition at 9:15 that morning at the federal courthouse on Kennedy Plaza, and he filed it alone, without his client beside him, a decision he had weighed through 2 nights. The petition was 4 pages long, and 3 of those pages were exhibits. The request itself consisted of a single paragraph. It didn't ask the court to declare Bogdan Vasilenko competent. It didn't ask the court to reconsider the conclusion reached by the neurology department at Wellington Memorial. It named no physician, didn't use the word error, didn't use the word negligence, and most especially, it didn't say a single word about who stood to benefit if the patient lived. It asked for exactly one thing, and Boyd had rewritten that paragraph 11 times until it had become so narrow that no one could oppose it without appearing to conceal something. It requested a 72-hour stay of the directive ending medical intervention, so that a recorded cognitive response assessment could be conducted on site, without invasive procedures, without altering any existing treatment order, performed by a qualified medical professional in the presence of a representative from neurology. The exhibits consisted of 3 pages of tables, and those 3 pages were what Boyd had spent 2 days obtaining. They contained 13 recorded times across 7 nights, compared against the medication's half-life, with the calculated period of lowest drug concentration expressed both in words and in numbers, and the final column listed the phenomena observed during that period on 3 consecutive nights, described in clinical language without a single adjective. Boyd hadn't obtained those numbers from Delphine Auclair. He hadn't met her, hadn't called her, didn't know her telephone number, and his client had issued a very clear instruction the night before that no one in the organization was to contact the nurse in any form. He had taken them from the internal report Wellington Memorial's administration had received the previous afternoon, the report accusing a night nurse of conducting observations outside the physician's orders, and that report had quoted the contents of her notebook, word for word, to demonstrate the seriousness of the violation. Boyd had read it and sat motionless for 30 seconds, then called his client and said that someone had just done for them the one thing neither of them had known how to do, because a document written privately by a nurse was the testimony of one person. That same document, once quoted by the hospital itself in an official hospital record intended to accuse its author, became what the court called authenticated by the opposing party. The hearing took place at 2 o'clock that afternoon and lasted 19 minutes. Wellington Memorial's attorney objected on 2 grounds, arguing that the request interfered with a medical judgment and that the petitioner wasn't the holder of the medical power of attorney. Boyd replied that the petition sought no change to any medical judgment and that the petitioner wasn't asking for decision-making authority of any kind, only enough time for an observation to be performed. The judge asked a single question. She asked the hospital's attorney whether, during those 11 weeks, the patient had ever been observed during the period identified in the exhibits. The hospital's attorney said he would need to check. The judge said that was precisely the point. She granted the stay, but not for 72 hours, because the main case had already been scheduled, and she couldn't allow a medical directive to remain unresolved through the weekend, so she granted 41 hours beginning at 8 o'clock that evening. Then she added a condition no one in the courtroom had anticipated, and she added it because she had been a federal judge for 18 years and had seen too many assessments conducted by people selected to produce a predetermined result. She ordered that the assessment be performed by the person who had created the original record cited in the exhibits, and that if anyone else performed it, the court wouldn't accept the result. Boyd stood there without allowing his expression to change, because he had practiced law for 30 years. But when he left the courtroom, he had to stop in the corridor for a moment. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Delphine Auclair received a call from Wellington Memorial's Human Resources Department, instructing her to report at 7 o'clock that evening. She arrived, and there were 4 people in the room, and none of them was pleased. Marguerite Pell from Legal Affairs told her that under a federal court order taking effect at 8 o'clock that evening, her access to the 8th floor neurology unit was being restored for a period of 41 hours, that she was assigned to conduct a cognitive response assessment on the patient in room 812, that the entire assessment would be recorded, and that the internal report concerning her remained under review, and that the restoration of her access didn't mean the report had been withdrawn. She stated that final sentence very clearly, and Dell understood that she was saying it to preserve an avenue of retreat for the hospital. Then Marguerite Pell told her the second thing, and she said it with the expression of someone being forced to read aloud a sentence she hadn't written. "A representative from neurology will remain in the room throughout the assessment," she said, "and under the court's order. That representative must be the person who signed the original conclusion." Dell walked out of the building at 7:25 with a badge bearing the 3 digits of the 8th floor in her hand, and she stood outside the main entrance for 1 minute trying to understand what had just happened. No one had called her. No one had suggested anything to her. No one had asked her to do anything. No one had given her anything. And not one line of the court order contained the name of the man who sat in the chair at the corner of room 812. He had told her no, and he had said no for every reason he had explained. And then he had done the one thing that saying no had allowed him to do. He had taken the only path that could be taken if he never touched her even once. 41 hours remained. Dell didn't conduct the assessment that same night, and it was the hardest decision she had made all week, because in the mind of everyone in the building, 41 hours meant doing it as soon as possible, while in Dell's mind, the trough opened only once every 24 hours, and if she performed the assessment at 9 o'clock at night, she would end up with 40 minutes of recorded footage, proving that the man didn't respond at all. She explained that to Boyd over the telephone at 8:10, the first conversation the two of them had ever had, and Boyd listened to everything before saying that if she waited until 2:15 in the morning, she would lose 18 of the 41 hours, and if the first attempt produced no result, she would have exactly one more chance. Dell said she understood. Boyd said he would be there at 1:30. They entered room 812 at 5 minutes before 2. There were 5 people and 1 camera inside the room. The camera had been mounted on a tripod in the corner opposite the chair where Emrys Vasilenko always sat, and a hospital technician switched it on at 1:54, and it wouldn't be turned off until everyone had left the room. Ephraim Boyd sat in a second chair with a stack of papers on his knees and a pen in his hand, and he wrote everything down by hand, recording the time before every line. Dr. Aurelio Santangelo remained standing about 1 meter from the foot of the bed, positioned where he could see both the monitor and Dell's hands, and in his right hand he held a stopwatch, the kind physicians use to count respirations, keeping it ready to press throughout the entire assessment. He had spoken only once upon entering the room, saying that he was present under court order, that he objected to the assessment on professional grounds, and that he wanted his objection entered into the record. Boyd entered it into the record. Dell stated the time aloud, the patient's name, and the name and title of every person in the room for the camera, then described the 3 things she intended to do and the limits of each one, also for the camera, because she had learned in Detroit that what protected a nurse wasn't doing the right thing, but stating beforehand exactly what she was going to do. She said that none of the procedures would cause pain, that no treatment order would be altered, that no medication would be administered or withdrawn, and that she would stop immediately if any measurement crossed the thresholds she read aloud in numbers. The first procedure used a steel tuning fork, which she struck against the side of the bed before placing its base against the bone behind the patient's ear, allowing the vibration to travel through the bone into the inner ear without passing through the air. She did it 3 times, with 20 seconds between each attempt, and read the number on the monitor aloud afterward. 59, 59, 59. The second procedure involved placing 2 fingers against the base of the patient's palm beneath the thumb, exactly as she had done 3 nights earlier, and she held them there and she waited for 4 minutes and 10 seconds, while Santangelo watched her hands through every one of those 4 minutes and 10 seconds without speaking, and nothing happened. Not one twitch, not one movement. Boyd recorded the time, and wrote that no response had been observed. The third procedure was the voice. Dell called the patient's name 3 times, and nothing happened. Then she did the final thing. The thing she had asked Boyd over the telephone whether she was permitted to do, and Boyd had said the court order didn't forbid it. She turned toward the chair in the corner. "Mr. Vasilenko," she said. "In 11 weeks, I've never heard you call him anything. Is there a name only the 2 of you know?" Emrys remained still for 3 seconds. Then he stood, took 2 steps toward the head of the bed, bent down, and spoke 1 word. It wasn't English. It was short, 2 syllables, and he spoke it very softly, even more softly than he usually spoke, and he said it in the way a person could only say a word if he had been saying it since childhood. Boyd stopped writing. On the monitor, the heart rate was 59. Dell began counting backward from 30. She counted silently in her head, watching the monitor, and Santangelo watched the monitor too, while Boyd watched Dell, and Emrys Vasilenko didn't look at the screen but at his father's face, 30 centimeters above it, without moving a single muscle. At 24, the heart rate was 59. At 20, 59. At 16, 59. And Dell heard the stopwatch in Santangelo's hand, a tiny click as his finger shifted position over the button. At 13, 59. At 9, 59. At 6, 59. And Dell knew exactly what would happen when she reached the end of the count. She knew that the recording would go before the court with Boyd's 3 pages of exhibits and prove what 19 people had written. She knew that she had stood before a man keeping watch beside his father's bed and told him that no one had examined his father during the only time when an examination might work, and now someone had, and the answer was no. At 3, 59. At 2, 59. At 1, 59. Santangelo lowered his hand. He said nothing, showed no sign of triumph, and Dell would remember that later, that there wasn't the slightest trace of triumph in him. He only looked at Boyd and said that he believed they had seen enough, then turned toward the door, 1 foot already stepping away from where he had been standing. Then a sound came from somewhere inside the room. It was the sound of a person drawing breath. It was deep and long, longer than any breath the machine beside the bed had produced in 11 weeks. And it hadn't come from the machine, and all 5 people in the room heard it, and the camera in the corner recorded it. No one in the room moved for 1 full second. Then the number on the monitor changed from 59 to 72, and Dell was at the right side of the head of the bed before it had time to change again. The eyelids of the man lying there opened. They didn't open at the same time. The right opened about half a second before the left, and they opened with the slow, heavy movement of a door that had been stuck for a very long time. And during the first 3 seconds, those eyes looked at nothing. They didn't focus. They drifted across the ceiling, across the light fixture, across the blue glow of the monitor. Then they began to search. Dell had seen this 4 times in Detroit, and all 4 times she had stood close enough to know what she was watching, and she knew this was the moment when a pair of eyes would search for the thing the brain behind them most needed to find, and that thing was almost always a face. Nadia Vasilenko stood near the left side of the foot of the bed, about 1 meter away, both hands gripping the bed rail, and she had begun saying her father's name. Emrys stood at the left side of the head of the bed, 30 centimeters above his father, and he had been there throughout the previous 30 seconds. Those eyes passed over Nadia. They passed over Emrys. Dell saw them pass over him, pause for less than a fraction of a second, then continue, and she saw it because she was the only person in the room watching the eyes, instead of watching the person she hoped they would choose. They moved on, past Nadia's shoulder, and locked in place. They locked onto the doorway, where the door stood open by about the width of a hand, revealing the 8th floor corridor, and they stayed there and didn't look away again. Dell turned her head in the direction of that gaze, and there was no one in the doorway, only a strip of light from the 8th floor corridor and the edge of a plastic chair. Then she looked back at the face of the man in the bed, and she had worked in this profession for 11 years and had stood beside many people in the moment they regained consciousness, and she knew what those faces looked like. They looked confused. They looked hurt. Sometimes, when someone familiar was close by, they looked like something for which no word existed. What appeared on Bogdan Vasilenko's face was none of those things, and Dell recognized it, and she recognized it because she had seen it on the faces of patients who knew that someone was coming into their room. On the monitor, 119, then 134. Heart rate, 134, Dell said aloud. And she said it for the camera, and for everyone in the room at the same time. Blood pressure, 190/102. The patient is experiencing an episode of sympathetic nervous system overactivity. I recommend immediate evaluation for a low-dose intravenous beta blocker. Dr. Santangelo, you're the only physician in this room. Santangelo had taken 2 steps toward the bed and was staring at the monitor, and his face had gone white in the very particular way of a man who had just seen something that 30 years in his profession had told him was impossible. He didn't read the monitor aloud. He didn't touch the patient. He stepped back half a pace, and then he began to speak, and he spoke quickly, faster than he had spoken at any point during the previous 4 days. He said this was exactly what he had warned them about. He said Nurse Auclair had performed a sequence of stimuli that wasn't included in any physician's order, that she had exceeded the scope of her licensed practice, that she had provoked an acute, sympathetic response that could cause cardiovascular complications in a brain-injured patient, and that he would report the matter to the state licensing board that morning. He stepped toward the door and called for security in the corridor. On the monitor, 147. Dell didn't leave the head of the bed. She placed 2 fingers against the patient's wrist to compare his pulse with the machine, read the time aloud, and stated that she was requesting it be entered into the record that she had recommended intervention and had not yet received a physician's order. Boyd wrote it down. 2 security officers entered the room and stood in the doorway, and neither of them knew what they were supposed to do. 151. Dell looked up and spoke 1 sentence, no louder than she had been reading the numbers. His heart rate is 151, she said. Are you going to argue, or are you going to treat him? Santangelo opened his mouth, and Emery's Vasilenko straightened from where he had been, leaning over the head of the bed, and took 1 step between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward anyone. His hands remained at his sides, and he stood about 1 meter from Santangelo, and he spoke 4 sentences in the low, slow voice that everyone in that building would remember for a very long time, because not 1 word was a threat, and that was precisely what made it frightening. He said there was a camera running in the corner of the room under the order of a federal court, and that it had been recording since 1:54. He said that during the previous 4 days, he hadn't called anyone, hadn't asked anyone for anything, and hadn't spoken a single word to this nurse beyond what that recording had captured. He said his father's heart rate was 151, that his eyes were open, and that everything happening in that room from that second forward would be reviewed by people who didn't know anyone in the building. Then he spoke the 4th sentence. He said he didn't care what papers the doctor filed with which board that morning, but if his father went into cardiac arrest during the next 40 minutes, the recording would show a department chief standing in the room, watching the number 151, and arguing. No one in the room said anything. Santangelo looked at the monitor. Then he turned toward one of the security officers and told him to have the emergency cart brought in, and he gave the order, and he gave it in the voice of a man reading aloud a sentence he had known from the beginning he would eventually have to read. Dell was already at the medication cabinet before he finished speaking. 40 minutes later, Bohdan Vasilenko's heart rate was 94 and stable, and both his eyelids remained open, and his eyes were still fixed on the doorway. Boyd closed his stack of papers. The 2 security officers had gone back outside. Santangelo had left 20 minutes earlier, after stating for the camera that he continued to maintain every one of his objections. Nadia Vasilenko sat in the chair in the corner, the chair no one else had occupied during the previous 11 weeks, and she sat there with both hands covering her face, unable to speak. Dell began putting everything away, and she did it with hands that trembled slightly, something she would only allow herself to notice later. Emery stood at the head of the bed. He watched her for a moment, then spoke. Your shift isn't over. The meeting took place at 10 o'clock that same morning in the conference room on the 10th floor, and Dell arrived after sleeping for 2 hours in a chair in the staff lounge because she hadn't gone home. In the room were Marguerite Pell from Legal Affairs, a man from Human Resources, an associate medical director Dell had never met, and Dr. Aurelio Santangelo, who sat with one empty chair separating him from the others. Ephraim Boyd sat to Dell's right, and he was there because the court order permitted legal counsel for the petitioner to attend every proceeding related to the assessment during the 41-hour period, and 11 hours of those 41 remained. Marguerite Pell began by saying that the hospital acknowledged what had occurred the previous night, and that the hospital had an obligation to review the entire process. Then she came to the point, and she did so with great precision, because she had been doing this work for 19 years and understood that an institution facing a lawsuit needed only one thing, a story in which the institution had acted correctly and one individual had acted wrongly. She said that an internal report concerning Nurse Claire had been filed before the court order was issued. She said the report showed that Dell had conducted observations outside the scope of her assignment over several nights and hadn't reported them through the proper channels. She said the hospital acknowledged that the result from the previous night was a positive one, but that a positive result didn't make an improper process proper, and that if the hospital failed to address this, it wouldn't be able to explain to anyone why a night nurse had been the only person in the building monitoring a patient over the course of several weeks. Dell understood exactly what was happening. The hospital had been placed in the position of having to answer a very difficult question, and there were two possible answers. The first was that the neurology department had reached the wrong conclusion for 11 weeks. The second was that a nurse had failed to follow proper procedure. The second answer was cheaper than the first, far cheaper, and Dell was the least expensive person in that room. She said she had reported, through the proper channel, that she had presented her observations directly to the head of neurology at 11:20 on Wednesday morning, and that if anyone wanted to know how that conversation had gone, they could ask the man sitting one empty chair away. Santangelo said he acknowledged that the conversation had taken place and that he had judged the information insufficient to justify changing the course of treatment, and that this had been his authority as the physician responsible for the case. Marguerite Pell said that was precisely her point, that this was a difference in professional judgment, and that when such a difference existed, the person in the lower position was required to comply. Boyd opened his leather briefcase. He said nothing while he did it, and he removed a neatly clipped packet of papers and slid it across the table toward Marguerite Pell, then slid a second copy toward the associate medical director. "This is a draft scientific report," Boyd said. "It was submitted to the program committee of a regional neurology conference for consideration for presentation in September. I obtained it from the conference's public information page. It isn't confidential material. It isn't a medical record, and nothing in it belongs to anyone's private information." The draft had a title and was 4 pages long. It discussed the limitations of recovery prognosis in cases of brain injury caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation, and on the 3rd page, it included an illustrative case. The case had been anonymized according to proper rules and described a 68-year-old male patient who had experienced 14 minutes of oxygen deprivation during a fire, and it was presented as a representative example of an outcome the author described as irreversible from the earliest stage. Boyd said he had no opinion on the scientific content of the draft because he was a lawyer. He asked only that they note 2 things printed on the document itself. The first was the date on which the conference system recorded the draft as having been submitted. It was the 18th day after the patient was admitted, which meant the 3rd week. The second was the final line on the 4th page, where the author's name and title appeared, and that name was Aurelio Santangelo, head of neurology, Wellington Memorial. No one in the conference room spoke for approximately 4 seconds. Boyd delivered his final sentence very slowly. "By the 3rd week," he said, "this patient's record contained only 2 scans and no response assessment conducted outside the medication period. I'm not saying the conclusion was wrong. I'm saying it was written, submitted, and signed before there was enough evidence to write it." Marguerite Pell read the 3rd page, then read the final line on the 4th, then placed the packet on the table, and she didn't look at Dell again for the remainder of the meeting. The associate medical director asked Santangelo one question, and only one, whether he had submitted the draft. Santangelo said that submitting a conference draft was a routine academic activity, and that its contents could be revised until the deadline. No one in the room regarded that as an answer. The meeting ended 9 minutes later. Marguerite Pell said the hospital would suspend the review process concerning Nurse Claire while certain other matters were clarified, and she used the word suspend, not withdraw, and Dell understood that this was how an institution kept hold of one end of the rope. Then she said the hospital would need to speak privately with the neurology department, and she said it while looking at the empty chair separating her from Santangelo, and during the following 2 hours, 3 telephone calls were made from the 10th floor that no one on the 8th floor knew about. Dell left the conference room at 11 o'clock, and Boyd walked with her to the elevator. He said he didn't believe they would continue pursuing her. Dell thanked him. Then she stood waiting for the elevator and realized that throughout the previous 70 minutes, in a room containing 5 people with power, not one of them had mentioned the only thing she had carried with her from the night before. No one had asked why a man awakening after 11 weeks had looked past his own son. No one had asked what those 2 eyes had locked onto, and no one in that building could answer her, because when she had turned to look, There had been no one in the doorway at all. The directive ending medical intervention was withdrawn that afternoon, not by the court, but by the very person who had signed it. And Nadia Vasilenko signed the withdrawal document in the family waiting room, with hands trembling so badly that Boyd had to hold the papers for her. The next 4 days were 4 days in which nothing dramatic happened, and they were the most important 4 days of the entire 11 weeks. Because during those 4 days, the medication was reduced, according to a new protocol written by a neurologist from Boston, and with every reduction, Bohdan Vasilenko's eyes remained open a little longer, and by the 4th day, they were open almost constantly, and they could follow a finger, and they could settle on a face, but he couldn't speak a single word. He couldn't move his head, couldn't move his hand, couldn't lift one finger from the bedsheet. And on the afternoon of the 2nd day, Del explained to his 2 children that after 11 weeks of immobility, the pathways between intention and muscle required far more time to recover than the brain required to awaken, and that the smallest muscles were always the first to return. On the 4th day, Del came in for the night shift, carrying a piece of stiff cardboard she had ruled by hand at home, and on it were 6 rows of letters, 5 letters in each row, written in large black marker. She had used this exact method for 4 years in Detroit, and she still remembered its abbreviated name. She explained it to the man in the bed before they began, and she explained it slowly, asking him to confirm each step by closing his eyes once for yes and twice for no. She asked whether he could hear her. Once, she asked whether he wanted to try. Once, Emrys Vasilenko sat on the opposite side of the bed, and Del told him he would be the one to write because she needed both hands to hold the board, and he asked what he was supposed to write on. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, inside room 812, there wasn't a single blank sheet of paper, because Boyd's papers had gone home with Boyd, and everything else in the room was a coded hospital form that no one was permitted to write on. Del searched the pockets of her scrub top. In the right pocket was a sheet of paper folded into 4 sections. She opened it, looked at it for 1 second, then folded it the opposite way, and handed it to him. He took it and looked at the front. 7 roads drawn with a ruler, a yellow square in the center with 4 trees larger than one of the roads, a lake with 3 ducks, and a house in the upper right corner with an arrow and 4 words, written in red pencil. He didn't ask anything. He turned it over, rested the blank side on his knees, and took out a pen. Del began. She pointed to the 1st row and waited. Nothing. The 2nd row. Nothing. The 3rd row, and both eyelids closed once. She began pointing to each letter in the 3rd row, and at the 2nd letter, his eyes closed once again, and Emrys wrote that letter on the back of the map. The 2nd letter took 4 minutes. The 3rd took more than 5 because halfway through the row, his eyelids began to slow, and Del had to let him rest for 90 seconds, and she sat silently through those 90 seconds, without saying anything, because she had learned in Detroit that what destroyed conversations like this wasn't the difficulty, but the impatience of the person sitting beside the bed. By the 5th letter, she realized she had guessed the word he was spelling, and she didn't say it aloud, because the first rule of this method was that the person in the bed was the one speaking. The 6th letter, rest. The 7th, 32 minutes had passed. Emrys Vasilenko hadn't spoken a single word during those 32 minutes. He had only written, and Del could see that his hand was gripping the pen more tightly than necessary. The 8th letter, the 9th, then both eyelids closed twice in succession, the signal for finished that Del had taught him at the beginning, and she lowered the board, stated the time aloud, and the clock on the wall of room 812 read 2:44 in the morning, 40 minutes after she had pointed to the 1st row. Emrys looked down at the paper on his knees. 9 letters, written in ballpoint ink on the back of a map drawn by a 7-year-old child. They weren't words of thanks. They weren't anyone's name. They weren't a message to his son after 11 weeks. Del read them at the same moment he did, and she read them twice, and the 2nd time, she understood that everything she had believed during the previous 2 weeks had been right, but far smaller than the truth. The man in the bed had said that twice, someone had entered the room at night and adjusted his intravenous line. Del stood perfectly still. Then she did what she was required to do. She confirmed every part of the message, once for yes and twice for no, because this was the kind of thing that would take both of them somewhere entirely different if even one detail were recorded incorrectly. She asked whether the person had been a hospital employee. Twice. No. She asked whether he had seen the person's face. Twice. No. She asked whether he recognized the person, and at that question, His eyelids didn't close once, and they didn't close twice. They only remained open, looking at her. And Dell had stood beside enough people to know that there were some questions a person wouldn't answer until they were answering the right person. She asked her final question. She asked whether he had been able to hear what people said in that room throughout the previous 11 weeks. Once. Yes. Dell sat down in the plastic chair beside the bed, and in that moment, the meaning of the entire previous 11 weeks changed before her eyes. 19 doctors had stood at the foot of that bed and read their verdicts aloud in front of a man who had heard every word. His son had sat in the corner every night counting his breaths, and he had known his son was there. His daughter had been unable to enter after the 7th week, and he had heard every time she stood outside the door without pushing it open. Someone had read aloud in front of him the date on which they would stop holding him in this world. And twice, during the night, someone whose face he couldn't see had entered the room and touched his intravenous line. And he had been awake, and he had heard every footstep, and he hadn't been able to lift a single finger. Dell didn't go to hospital administration with those 9 words, and she weighed that decision through the final 2 hours of her night shift before deciding against it, because she understood exactly how they would be read. A nurse with an internal report that had been suspended but not withdrawn, bringing hospital administration a sheet of paper written on the back of a child's map, containing the words of a patient who had just awakened after 11 weeks under medication, and accusing someone of entering his room at night. No one in that building would read it as an accusation. They would read it as proof that neither person in that room could be trusted. So she did something else. She did the thing she had the right to do, because while the court order remained in effect, she was still the nurse assigned to that patient, and an assigned nurse had the right to request the physician's order records for her own patient. She requested a complete printout of the overnight verbal orders from all 11 weeks. The entire 11 weeks, not merely 7 nights. It arrived within 2 hours, a thick stack of papers, and Dell took it home and sat at the dining table with a pencil and the map beside her, and she began with the first week. During the 11 weeks, medication had been added at night 41 times. 39 of those times had entirely reasonable explanations that could be matched to some change in the monitoring record. An episode of tachycardia, a rise in blood pressure, a change in position. Dell marked those 39 entries and set them aside. 2 remained. One occurred on Tuesday night of the 6th week at 1:52. The other occurred on Sunday night of the 9th week at 2:34. Those 2 differed from the other 39 in only one way, and Dell had to compare them 3 times before she believed her own eyes. Nothing had changed in the monitoring record beforehand. There had been no episode of tachycardia, no rise in blood pressure, not one line indicating that anything had happened. The medication had been added for no reason at all. Then she took out the floor access log, which she had requested at the same time, and which no one had seen any reason to deny because it wasn't part of the medical record. And she compared those 2 nights, and she found 2 things. The first was that on both nights, Emrys Vasilenko hadn't been inside the building. The access log showed it clearly. On Tuesday night of the 6th week, he hadn't gone to the 8th floor at all. On Sunday night of the 9th week, he arrived at 11 o'clock and left at 12:40, nearly 2 hours before the medication was added. During those 11 weeks, there had been 14 nights when he was absent or left early, and the 2 nights with no reason were 2 of those 14 nights. The second thing was in the acknowledgement column. Every overnight verbal order required a nurse's signature, and on those 2 nights, the signature in that column wasn't the signature of the nurse assigned to the room. It was the signature of the night shift head nurse. Dell stared at those 2 signatures for a very long time. Then she folded the stack of papers, slept for 4 hours, and arrived at the hospital at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 hours before the night shift began, because that was when Ruben Tallow arrived. She stopped him in the western parking lot, in the exact place where he had waited for her 6 days earlier, and handed him the 2 sheets with pencil circles around the entries. Ruben took them. He read the first sheet, and his face didn't change. He read the second, and Dell saw what happened when his eyes reached the acknowledgement column. It wasn't the expression of a man who had been caught. It was the expression of a man seeing his own signature somewhere he didn't understand why it was. Dell asked whether he remembered those 2 nights. Ruben said he signed verbal orders for the entire floor when the assigned nurse was inside another room, that it happened several times each week, that it was procedure, and that there was nothing wrong with it. Dell said she knew. She said she hadn't come to accuse him of doing anything wrong. She said she had come to ask who had called those 2 orders down. Ruben Tallow stood in the parking lot with the 2 sheets in his hands, and he didn't speak for quite a long time, and Dell stood there without pressing him, because she had learned long ago that there was a kind of silence that would close forever if someone interrupted it. Then he said he didn't remember. He said that during a night shift, he received between 6 and 10 calls with verbal orders, that he wrote them down, signed them, and that was the end of it. He said that now, after looking at those 2 sheets, he couldn't tell her that the calls had come from the physician on duty, because he didn't remember, and because he understood that if he didn't remember, it meant he hadn't verified it. Then he said the sentence Dell had waited 6 days to understand. He said that 6 days earlier, when he had stood in this exact place and told her not to trust anyone who said they were protecting her, he hadn't been speaking about Dr. Santangelo. He said someone had come to see him 2 weeks earlier, someone who didn't work for the hospital, and that person had told him there was a night nurse independently monitoring a patient belonging to their family, that it would be in her best interest for it to stop before it became something larger, and that the kindest way to handle it would be to transfer her. He said he had believed that was true. He said he had believed he was helping her. He said that when her locker was opened, he hadn't known, and that when he found out, he understood that the person who had come to him 2 weeks earlier hadn't cared about her at all, and that he himself had signed his name on these 2 sheets many weeks before that. He said that was why he hadn't told her anything except one sentence, and that it wasn't because anyone had threatened him, but because he didn't know how deeply he had taken part in what was happening, and he was afraid of the answer. Dell asked who the person was. Reuben said the person hadn't given a name, and Dell believed him. Then he said he had one more thing. He said the night orderly on the 8th floor wasn't a hospital employee, but had been supplied through a temporary staffing contractor, and that he had the contractor's name because he was the person required to sign the work hour verification form every 2 weeks. He took out his telephone, searched for it, and read the name aloud to her, and Dell wrote it on the back of the map, directly beneath the 9 words. Dell handed the map to Emrys Vasilenko at 2:10 the following morning. Both sides of it, the 9 words on one side and a company name written beneath them, and he read that name without asking her a single question. He only said that he needed her out of this from that point forward, and he said it not as an order but as a man reading aloud something that was already perfectly clear, that from that second on, what was about to happen was no longer the work of a nurse, and that if her name appeared anywhere in it, everything she had done would be read again in a different way. Dell understood. She took the map back, folded it into 4, slipped it into the pocket of her scrub top, and finished her shift. Emrys Vasilenko didn't need to call anyone to know what the name on the back of that paper meant. It belonged to a temporary staffing contractor registered in Pawtucket, one of roughly 30 small companies his family's organization had created over the course of 20 years to conduct legal business with money that hadn't always been legal, and Emrys knew it. Knew it so well that he didn't need to look it up, because it was one of 4 companies his father had marked for closure the previous August. He remembered that conversation clearly. His father had been sitting in the greenhouse behind the house and had said that he was 68 years old, that it was time to preserve whatever part of the business could still be preserved and close whatever couldn't, and that those 4 companies would be shut down before the end of the year, while everything legitimate that remained would be transferred into Nadia's name, because Nadia had never signed anything she would later have to explain. Emrys had asked who would tell the people who had lived for 40 years through those 4 companies. His father had said he would tell them himself. That conversation had taken place 6 weeks before the warehouse fire, and Emrys had been one of 2 people present. The second was Josip Kravitz. They sat at opposite ends of the long table in the greenhouse at 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Only the 2 of them, the door open, with no one standing outside. Josip Kravitz was 61 years old, and had been with the family since he was 21, and he was the man who had taught Emrys to drive, and the only person in 40 years who had been permitted to tell Bogdan Vasilenko no, in a room where others were present. Emrys placed the map on the table and slid it across. Josip read the 9 words on the front. Then he turned it over and read the company name on the back. Then he set the paper down, and he didn't deny anything. He said he had wondered how long it would take. Emrys asked whether he had done it, and Josip said that wasn't the right question, and that if Emrys asked the right one, he would understand. He said he hadn't been at the warehouse that night, and that was true, and could be verified. He said he had merely failed to do one thing. He said there were 3 doors at that warehouse, and that every Thursday, someone inspected all 3 and reported to him, and that during that particular week, he hadn't read the report and hadn't asked about it. He said it once and didn't repeat it, and then he added 4 more words. The rest was weather. Emrys asked what the previous 11 weeks had been. Then, Josip said that once a person had stood outside an event, the only thing left to do was make certain it wasn't reversed. He said Emrys's father hadn't died that night, and that was the one thing he hadn't calculated, and that everything he had done afterward had consisted only of very small acts. He said he had placed a man on the 8th floor through a company whose contract he himself had signed, and that the man had never done anything more than push a linen cart 3 times each night, twice during those 11 weeks, place a telephone call to the nurses' station. He said he had sat with Nadia for 4 afternoons during the 7th week, when she hadn't slept for 3 nights, and had told her exactly what the doctors had told her, without adding a single word, because nothing more was necessary, because an exhausted person only had to hear the same thing from 2 directions, before believing it was the only truth. He said he had arranged the paperwork for her, and shown her where to sign, and that she had thanked him. He said he had taken the notebook, and that he hadn't taken it to hide it but to submit it to the proper people, because an accusation written by the hospital itself ended the story far more cleanly than a burned notebook ever could. Emrys asked his final question, and he asked it very slowly. He asked whether Josip had been inside the building on the night his father opened his eyes. Josip Kravitz didn't answer in words. He only looked at Emrys, and during those 2 seconds, Emrys saw what 40 years had never allowed him to see, and he understood that the eyes awakening after 11 weeks hadn't passed over his face because they failed to recognize him, but because they had found something else first. In the doorway behind Nadia, where a 61-year-old man had been standing and watching, Emrys sat in silence for a very long time. Throughout the 40 years of this organization, everyone who had ever sat at opposite ends of that table had known exactly what followed a conversation like this, and Josip Kravitz knew better than any of them, because for 40 years, he had been the man who arranged it. He sat there without asking for anything and without standing. Then Emrys rose, walked to the greenhouse door, and did something no one in the organization, including the man sitting at the far end of the table, had ever seen anyone named Vasilenko do. He called Ephraim Boyd and told Boyd to contact the federal marshal assigned to his family's case. The man in the coat, who had sat in the plastic chair across from room 812 every night for 11 weeks, the man Emrys had walked past hundreds of times without once looking directly into his face. He told Boyd that he wanted to speak with that man the following morning, with legal counsel present and the conversation recorded, and that he wanted to speak about a warehouse in Pawtucket, a door inspection report that hadn't been read, a temporary staffing contract, and 2 telephone calls placed to the 8th floor nurses' station. Boyd remained silent at the other end of the line for 4 seconds, then asked whether Emrys understood what that would mean for him personally. Emrys said he understood. Then he turned back and told the man at the far end of the table that he should call his lawyer, and he said it in the same low, slow voice he always used, and that was the final sentence he ever spoke to Josip Kravitz. The Rhode Island State Board of Nursing licensure hearing took place on a Thursday morning in a windowless conference room on Broad Street, and Delphine Auclair arrived alone. Ephraim Boyd had offered to accompany her, and she had said no, not because she didn't need him, but because she had realized something during the 3 weeks she had spent waiting. If she entered that room with the Vasilenko family's lawyer beside her, everything she said afterward would be heard as the words of someone with powerful support behind her, and she had made it through 11 years in the profession without anyone standing behind her, and she wanted this hearing to be the same. She presented her case for 40 minutes. She didn't use a single adjective. She read the times, read the numbers, and recounted in exact order what she had done and what she hadn't done. And when the board asked why she had continued taking notes after being transferred, she said that she hadn't continued taking notes after the transfer. And that was true, and the records proved it. Ruben Tallow testified after her. No one had asked him to appear. No one was protecting him, and he had submitted his own request to testify 3 weeks earlier. He spoke for 20 minutes, and during those 20 minutes, he testified that he had been the one who acknowledged 2 verbal orders without verifying them, that he had been the one who agreed to transfer a nurse because he believed doing so would protect her, and that he understood what this meant for his own license. No one in the room had asked him to say that final part. The board issued its decision 11 days later. Delphine Auclair's 5-year monitoring agreement was terminated early. Her advanced practice license was fully restored, and Wellington Memorial's internal report was entered into the record as unsubstantiated. The only condition Del raised when she signed the official record had nothing to do with herself. She asked that her entire Detroit file, including both the documentation complaint and the testimony no one had ever mentioned, be placed in the board's public review archive so that other nurses in the state could read it and understand what happened to someone who spoke aloud about what she had seen, and so that the next person wouldn't have to pay the price Dell had paid in order to learn. The board approved her request. 7 months later, on a Saturday afternoon, there were 6 people and one long table inside the greenhouse behind the Vasilenko family estate. Bohdan Vasilenko sat in a wheelchair at the head of the table, and he had been able to sit that way for 4 months, and his right hand could lift a light cup if he was given enough time. His voice was slow and distorted, and every sentence took him 4 times longer than it normally would. But his mind was completely clear, so clear that Nadia still said she was more afraid of arguing with her father now than she had ever been before. Dell sat in the middle of the table. She worked there 3 afternoons each week as a rehabilitation coordinator and spent the remaining days at another hospital in the city. And she had made that a condition from the beginning, that she wouldn't work for only one family, and Emery's had agreed, without asking why. Tamsin was 7.5 years old and had declared 2 months earlier that Mr. Bohdan was her friend. And that afternoon she stood beside his wheelchair with both fists tightly closed behind her back. "Guess?" she said. Bohdan asked what he was supposed to guess, and it took him 10 seconds to finish the question. And Tamsin waited through all 10 seconds without interrupting because she had learned how to do that a long time ago. "Which hand has something in it?" she said, holding both fists out in front of him. Bohdan studied those small hands very carefully, with the concentration of a man who had spent 40 years surviving by reading what other people were holding. And he said, "The left one." Tamsin opened her left hand. It was empty. Then she opened her right hand too, and the right one was empty as well. And she laughed so hard that she had to hold on to the arm of his wheelchair. And she said she hadn't been hiding anything at all. He had only thought she was. Bohdan Vasilenko laughed. It was a small and difficult sound, and Nadia had to put down her cup. Dell looked at the 2 little hands, spread open over the table, and remembered a morning inside an apartment on Cranston Street. And she didn't say anything about it to anyone. Then Bohdan slowly turned his head to the right and looked at his son, who was standing at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee in his hand. And Bohdan did the thing he had practiced for 7 months, the thing his speech therapist had said he might never be able to do, because its first sound was the most difficult sound for him to form. He called his son's name. He said it aloud, clearly enough for all 6 people in the greenhouse to hear. Emery's Vasilenko placed his coffee on the table. He couldn't say anything at all. This story doesn't end with a powerful man winning, because he didn't win through his power, but by accepting that there are some doors power can't open. Nor does it end with a good person receiving a reward, because Dell had to stand alone in the final room, and no one came to save her. It ends with something far simpler and far more truthful. No one in this world has the right to decide for us that we are no longer worth saving, no matter how many degrees they hold, no matter how gently they speak, no matter how old we are or how long we have lain still. The person who sees the truth is often not the person who has the authority to see it, but the person willing to remain for 4 more minutes after everyone else has already walked away. And the thing that causes the greatest harm in life is often not an enemy who stands openly against us, but the trust we place in the hands of someone unworthy of it, because we can guard ourselves against an enemy, while for someone we trust, we open the door and let them enter. Courage, in the end, turns out not to be loud at all. It is only one person who is too tired, too poor, too easily replaced, standing in a room at 2 o'clock in the morning, placing a hand upon another human being and choosing to listen. If the story of Dell, Emery's, and the man in room 812 has touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that each day you can hear more compelling stories like this one. How did today's story make you feel? And if you were Dell, would you have dared to remain in that room for 4 more minutes? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what is moving inside the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.